Okay. So you will see my face, I promise. I did attempt to do the dual screen. I did not like how it looked, so um, I will appear at the end. Greetings. My name is Yannick Ladson. Today we are going to talk about anxiety and depression and its atypical symptom presentation in Black, Indigenous people of color. I am going to try to get everything in within this time frame. Hopefully, my technology works appropriately. Okay, so my ground rules are really simple. Going into this, just try to keep in mind that one size does not fit all. I will not provide a chart that breaks down how different ethnic groups emote or present uh, in terms of mental illness. I actually hate charts because it's overgeneralization. There also will not be any checklist. Um, this is just things that I've seen in practice and observations from my colleagues, in addition to research. So, this term, BIPOC, is new. It actually came about during last summer's racial unrest. And it's really trying to make people of color, POC, terminology more inclusive, a person first language that we use in mental health. We're applying it to people of color so that it honors the unique experiences of Black and Indigenous individuals and their communities, as well as the spectrum of existence and experience by people of color. So this is a new term that you will hear being used. You may hear me go back and forth between POC and BIPOC because it's new language, new terminology. So I wanted to give us an idea of the population that we serve. And so I looked at the demographics for Trenton. And if you look at this, this is the when we talk about people of color, who are we talking about? For Trenton, 50% identify as Black alone, 38% Hispanic Latinx, 1.4% Asian alone, 1.4% two or more races, less than 1% Native American, at least 29% of our population is living in poverty, and almost half, 39%, of the households in Trenton speak a language other than English. So that's something important to know about the community we serve. When you look at Mercer County Community College, this is a demographic breakdown of our students of color. Now, when we talk about people of color, it's how a person identifies. So it's up to you how you racially identify. Some people consider themselves transracial. That's another new term that's come about in the last few years. Um, and so this is how people identify. So 20% Black, 20% Hispanic Latinx, 7% Asian, 3% two or more races. Um, when we look at, well, who is Black, who is Indigenous, who are these people, right? Um, so when we look at that, the U.S. Census considers anyone from sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean to be Black or African American or of African descent. Okay. Now, of course, there's arguments about that because it's not including the whole continent of Africa. But again, this is how people identify themselves. Uh, when we look at Indigenous, that includes Native American, Alaskan Native, and First Nation people of Canada. There are 574 sovereign tribal nations across 35 states, according to the National Congress of American Indians. And there are 334 federally and state recognized reservations. When we look at the Latinx population, it's important to note that we are talking about an ethnicity. And so, therefore, within this ethnicity, this is how people of the Latinx, Hispanic ethnicity identify racially in the US Census in 2017. If you notice, overwhelmingly, 65% identify as white. Okay, so when we talk about these issues, we have to make sure we know who we're talking about. Only 2% identify as Black. Some of you may know part of this is due to racial injustice in in Latin countries, in the Caribbean, colorism, here in the United States and abroad. So some of the people that identify as white may not look white or may have African descent. But part of it has to do with issues around identification and the terminology. Something that I always like to mention is that the Black Power movement happened here in the US. It did not happen in the Caribbean. So the racial pride in being Black is something that is indicative to United States in terms of even being called by a color. So when we look at the continent of Asia, I would like you to look at the different areas. A lot of these areas, north, south, especially if you look at Central Asia, Western Asia, a lot of people within the countries listed identify as white. There were US Supreme Court cases in terms of who is considered white. If you look at the Theed case and the, I think, Tanaka case, where Indian American and a Japanese American fought for the right to be identified as white. So when we look at census information, some people that identify as white on the census, again, are from some of these countries, okay? So I wanted to point that out because not everyone that is considered Black, Indigenous, Latinx, or Asian identify as a person of color. Whenever we're talking about identities, it's important to note that we are more than our ethnicity and our racial background. These are our multiple identities. So in counseling, we always ask a person about how they identify, not their aesthetic. So a lot of times we assume a person's identity is based on aesthetics, but we are more than what you see. And so when we look at your identities, we're looking at you as a three-dimensional being, right? Something I wanted to point out is that queer youth of color, and again, when we talk about terminology, I think the next session focuses on terminology. You may hear a term QTPOC, that's queer, trans, people of color. When we look at youth of color who identify as queer, if you look at these statistics, it's staggering. 20 to 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ. Among them, 44% identify as Black, 26% identify as Latino or Latinx. Also, when you look at college completion rates, if you look at the completion rates amongst LGBTQ, they're lower than the students who are non-LGBTQ. So these are things to consider when we're talking about identities beyond racial and ethnic identities. There are other marginalized identities that come into play. So when we talk about anxiety, I'm not going to go over anxiety symptoms and the criteria that must be met to be diagnosed with anxiety. But what I do want to cover today is what typically we hear from Black, Indigenous people of color when they're describing their symptoms, because it's not typical and it's outside of the framework of the diagnostic manual that we use. So a lot of times people of color go undiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or misdiagnosed, mainly because of symptom presentation and sometimes the inability to articulate it in a way that fits into a very narrow criteria that we have in diagnosing. So if the person doesn't say, well, I'm feeling hopeless, and use keywords or trigger words that therapists are used to hearing, they may miss it. And so sometimes there's colloquialisms or cultural vernacular that a person may not be familiar with and miss it. So some of these you may have heard. My nerves are bad. I'm having a nervous breakdown. I think I'm going to blow a gasket. I'm hot, meaning I'm mad. Or expressing embarrassment or shame. For people of color, shame and embarrassment is a big one. And that has to do with, and we'll talk about that later, which is one of the stigmas in trying to be the model minority. And so having and not feeling like you are living up to the idea of who you should be. And so having embarrassment and shame for not meeting those standards. And so having butterflies in my stomach. A lot of complaints that you will hear are somatic complaints, because when I worked in the ER, we would have people come in and they would say, I'm having a heart attack, or they were overheating, and they were really in distress. And a lot of times it was a panic attack. So many times it's because it's more acceptable in our culture to have a medical condition, people will express emotional and psychological distress as a physical complaint. So you may hear them say they have headaches, migraines, stomach aches, chest pain, nausea, trouble breathing. When you think of the fight or flight syndrome, when the central nervous system is activated, right? Those same reactions that we have when we're in danger, people feel when they're anxious or in panic. So for them, it's real, it's not fake. They are legitimately in distress. Some common statements we hear regarding depression by people of color. Denial. I'm okay, I'm fine. I feel angry all the time. I don't know why I'm angry. I just feel angry, like I just want to burst. Here are some other ones. I'm sure some of you, if you want to put in a chat or if you just want to shout them out, what are some statements that you may have heard people make within your own culture regarding depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms? Some of us, probably have heard growing up, and we didn't know there was technical language for it. I have a lot of people depending on me, so I have to be okay. The idea of not being able to fall apart because you have so many people that need you. Uh, I don't want someone to think I'm crazy because of the stigma, again, around mental health, that fear of being seen as crazy or being taken away. And a lot of that has to do with historical discrimination within our country of how people with mental illness, and especially people of color with mental illness, have been treated. That fear of having your children taken away, the fear of being hospitalized against your will. TV does not help this at all. Uh, this happens every day. Again, people minimizing it. We're in a pandemic. Everybody feels lonely. Everybody feels isolated. Everyone is feeling it. And so minimizing it to not deal with it. Um, let's see. And then inappropriate guilt. So that's a term that we use as criteria, but how it may be expressed is, I'm sorry for depressing you. I'm sorry for being such a burden. When people say things like that, that's inappropriate guilt. One that we hear a lot is religious. I'm just going to pray about it. God will take it away. I don't know who's in control of my life. Is it God? Is it the devil? Is it something I've done in my life? So those were statements. Some of the presentations that we also come in contact, and some of you may have had experience with this. I come from a very religious family, and I cannot tell you how often I get into conversations about this where people say, I will pray it away. I don't need a therapist. And so my answer to that is, what's wrong with having prayer and a therapist? There's nothing wrong with that, right? So that idea that it's like a all or none, we can have it all. We can use these methods along with other tools that exist, right? So this idea of having bad juju, or it's a spiritual punishment. I'm paying a penance for something I did. And so one of the things that I work on when people are punishing themselves is that what in any religion, typically, if there's a deity, the deity is typically gives grace and mercy. And so so when we talk about that idea, it's more so punishing yourself than thinking of a deity punishing you. And so we talk about giving yourself grace, and using religion and spirituality actually helps a lot. When a person is spiritual, it actually helps a lot in therapy, no matter what their religion is. So as you see, this is symbolic of chakras. So one of the things that people may say is that my chakras are out of alignment or my energy is off. Now that could be. No one is disputing that. But again, why are your chakras off? Why is your energy off? And digging into that. And so that's another way that people may present working a lot. So it's really easy to avoid. And what we find, especially in men, is that men will consume themselves with work when they're depressed. So research has shown that men will become really consumed with work. Not saying that anyone else that identifies outside of being a man doesn't. But research has shown significant levels and increase of workload as a mechanism to avoid. And then, so a lot of times people don't see anger and aggression as being depressed because we look at what we see on television. Television always shows us someone sad and moping around and isolated. But in people of color, one of the reasons why it's a lot of times goes misdiagnosed or it's criminalized is because it shows up as anger, agitation, aggression. And so constantly having conflicts with others, which can, if you're a person of color, can lead to a negative interaction with authorities or law enforcement. And so the unfortunate piece is a person could be dealing with depression, and instead of getting treatment, they're put in jail. And they're not given that option of saying, well, what else is going on with this person? But constantly having conflicts, conflicts with peers, conflicts with family, and how this may present with students is that students in a group, working in groups and breakout rooms, and they're constantly a source of contention with this student. In every group they work with, or every course they're in, there's an issue. Or when a student talks to you, they're telling you about how everyone else is a problem, and they can't understand why no one can get it right, and they're always right. I'm sure we have come into contact with some of those, maybe even in our personal lives, right? So I was leery about putting this one because the stereotype of an angry Black woman. But one of the things that I like about this picture, and this was actually about an article around that, is that when we look at the things that have been happening because of stereotypes, a lot of times people are afraid to emote because of potential repercussions. Because if I'm not emoting in a way that is deemed normal or appropriate in our society, then it's wrong. And I could be, there may be negative consequences for me. So again, in people of color, depression may show up as anger, frustration. When we had the unrest last summer, I was in Philadelphia, and for me, all I saw was pain and trauma. And so when we look at why people do things, we have to look beyond just, oh, well, they're burning their own communities. Well, why is that? Well, no one listened when we had peaceful protests. No one listened to silence, right? There were silent protests. There was kneeling. There was different methods that were used that were also criticized, actually. But when buildings started burning, then companies, colleges, institutions started putting out emails, started creating commercials saying that Black Lives Matter. Now, it could have just been for, the moment, but none of those things happened until the city started burning. And so I'm not condoning it, but when we talk about trauma, especially when we talk about racial trauma, anger and frustration is just burning, like in this picture, burning inside. And at some point, it is going to show up. It's going to show up either in how you treat others, how you interact with your significant other, your children. And in some cases, it showed up in a public, in a really public way.
So, hey, Dr. Latz, question, if you don't mind my interrupting you.
Sure.
Is this applicable, that is the previous slide, is this applicable to what took place last Wednesday with some of the people who were rather upset about the Trump situation, that nobody paid attention until they went berserkers down there, or what? Mm-hmm. I mean, are we using the same yardstick, or is it applicable?
No, we are not.
Okay, I want to be sure. I just want to be clear.
We're not. If we were in one of my DEI sessions, I would go deeper.
Okay.
But I'm gonna.
Okay, yeah, I understand.
If we were in one of my racial trauma sessions, I would go deeper into that. But what I would say is, when you talk about systemic racism, when you talk about people fighting for freedom, in terms of to live, is a lot different than fighting for an election. So I will leave it at that. So
got it. I got you. Yeah, I wanted to be sure that I at least addressed the question rather than let it go. You know what I'm saying? So
I know. I understand. You're putting me on the spot.
No, sister. No. I don't mean to do that. Honestly, no. Honestly, I don't. Thank you.
So, I mean, yes. This is a question that's constantly come up, and I've gotten this question a lot during the last week or so. Again, that would take a whole nother hour session to delve into. And I do workshops on racial trauma and multi-generational trauma. And but again, like I said, that's a whole nother hour.
Gotcha.
So the last thing I wanted to mention about depression is sensitivity to pain. So one of the symptoms of depression is the sensitivity to pain. And so a person may have a lot of body aches, muscle aches, joint pain that they're having, and it's unexplainable. They may go to the doctor and the doctor's like, I don't see anything. And so that's also one of those physical complaints that could be related to depression. I also wanted to show you this graphic that depression and anxiety overlap. So there is a lot of overlap, even beyond what this graphic is showing, because you can be frustrated, which is on the depression side, and it could be an anxiety symptom. So if you notice, there's a lot of overlap. It's not unusual for someone to have a dual diagnosis. When we talk about excessive worrying, agitation, trouble thinking and concentrating, these are things that you would see in a classroom. A person could look right at you and then look engaged and get nothing out of it. I cannot tell you how many classes that I've taught, and I really thought the student wasn't, they seemed to be enjoying the class. They were engaged and were taking notes, and their grades were horrible. They did poorly on every assignment, didn't even turn in assignments. I don't know if any of you have had that experience, but they fooled their classmates. And so a lot of times there's something else going on, where they're doing that, again, trying to be a model, right? Trying to appease the professor because you're in front of them. But it's easy to not submit an assignment, and unless you're picking it up one by one. But if everyone's turning it in a stack or submitting it online, it's easy to hide. And so a lot of times, paying attention to behaviors, which is hard in the online format, But uh, these things can be done. People, what they show in the classroom, they also show in online behavior. Um, some risk factors for mental illness and Black, Indigenous people of color. That is such a mouthful. Um, poverty. Poverty is a risk factor. Food insecurity. Those are things that the college is working on dealing with in terms of food insecurity. And now that we have the Amazon wish list, and we're working, that's one of the things we're working on, right? Exposure to violence, compounded community trauma. So when you look at all the things that happened in this last year, everybody's been traumatized in some form or fashion, right? But if you were in a community that was actually involved in, like when I was in Philly, I would hear the the bombings, the M8s going off, and I would hear the helicopters and the sirens and see the fire. So that is traumatizing. People that were in Katrina, one of the things that was not dealt with is that those that survived Katrina have PTSD. Even if you're not there, just us witnessing it by watching it on TV is traumatizing. So I always tell people be careful how much you absorb in terms of television, in terms of social media, because it is traumatizing. And it can trigger you, and you can have PTSD symptoms just by being an observer. Repeated experiences with discrimination, chronic exposure to racism. These are all risk factors for mental illness. When we look at depression and suicide risk factors, exposure to racial inequality, exposure to violence, maladaptive coping skills. We learn those through, our family. So if our family never appropriately dealt with depression, if it was dealt with by using alcohol or substances, that becomes a generational um, thing that is passed on. That, okay, this is how we deal with it, or not talking about certain issues or things that happen. Social isolation, which all of us are experiencing in some form or fashion. Family dysfunction, psychological distress. Family needs are placed above individual needs. This happens a lot, especially when you talk about immigrant families. Um, I have to do well because my parents or my grandparents fought to come here. And it's up to me to be and do everything, right? And so that extra pressure of succeeding, that extra pressure of having to come through and be there and not fall apart. Homelessness. Um, Before the pandemic, and even more so now, housing insecurity has increased, and it's been a constant issue in colleges. You would be surprised how many college students do not have a consistent place to rest their head. And you would never know. I've had students that were living in their cars and were always clean, always neat. But there were other tells that something was going on. Substance abuse, trauma, stress, and that could be in your personal life, um, on a job, unemployment, and an access to lethal means. Firearms is the predominant method in suicides amongst Black people. History of family, a family history of suicidal ideation or attempts also increases the risk of suicide. Anxiety risk factors, exposure to stressful and negative life or environmental events in early childhood or adulthood, a history of anxiety or other mental illnesses and biological relatives, excessive caffeine use. So, a lot of things can relate back to what we eat. So, one of the things that I always mention is that people of color typically have uh, our cultural foods, our diet is high sugar, high salt, high carb. And so this does affect how your brain functions. So, a good documentary is Fed Up. It'll say like FU, and it's about how sugar affects the brain. Sugar has the same chemical effect as cocaine on your brain, but it's legal. And so it's not regulated the same way. However, if it was good for us, then on the back of the nutrition label, you would see a daily amount that you should have. If you look at anything, a lot of you are at home, take a look at a nutrition label and you'll see that sugar does not have your daily dosage on there. The reason why is because they have great lobbyists that um, work to not have it put on there, because you should only have 6 teaspoons of sugar a day, according to the World Health Organization. 6 teaspoons is more than what is in a regular can of soda. So, of course, that's not going to go on our nutritional labels because there's a lot of foods we probably would not want to eat. Caffeine also contributes to some other psychological symptoms. So, caffeine, sugar definitely contribute to different symptoms. And then there's foods that help symptoms. Smoking, alcohol use, those things also increase anxiety. So a lot of times people will take those things to decrease their anxiety, and it only makes it worse. So when we talk about barriers to getting help, insurance, no shocker there. One of the things that people don't know is that many therapists do not take insurance because of the low reimbursement rates. And the other piece is it's very difficult to even get on the insurance panels. So I would say the average price right now in Jersey is probably between 120 to 200 for a session. And typically people have at least one session a week. And that's if they're not severe, right? And so that's expensive. That adds up. So you'd be surprised how many therapists, and then when you add on to it, you're trying to find someone who has the same cultural background, that's even less. And many therapists of color do not take insurance, unfortunately. And then when you add to that LGBTQ therapist, there's a long waiting list. So there's a center in Philadelphia. There's Gateway, and then there's another one. I can't think of the name right now. And they have a 6-month waiting list to get in. But they're LGBTQ center. And I actually talked to them about that. Like, what other resources are out there? And unfortunately, it's very limited when you talk about looking for someone who has certain specialties or identities that they work with. So, and most people of color will not seek treatment until the symptoms are severe. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was stigma, right? Internalizing that model minority stereotype, the shame of not meeting expectations, which I also mentioned earlier, And then the idea of being a perpetual foreigner, that stereotype. So a lot of times, again, people go by aesthetics. So I may have been born here, raised here, but because of the way I look, people assume that I'm a foreigner and I was born and raised here. I even have an American accent, or I have a Northeastern accent, right? But people still see me as a foreigner. So those are barriers to people getting treatment. And then cultural beliefs. Um, Religion is a big one. Um, I'm going to rely on my spirituality. I'm going to rely on um, my spiritual practices to get me through. And so I don't need therapy. I need Jesus. I don't need therapy. I need meditation or prayer or an exorcism, because there's demonic entities that are um, present. Not saying that those things aren't needed, but why not have a comprehensive treatment plan that includes your spiritual practices and therapy? So I work with clergy to build that bridge amongst religion and therapy, um, especially when we talk about the Black and Latinx community, um, especially when we're talking about evangelical and Catholic communities, because of the stigma around receiving mental health treatment. And then alternative treatments, acupuncture, yoga, detox cleanses, energy work. Um, there's a lot of, now, again, there's therapists that do these things too. I know therapists that actually do yoga and meditation and mindfulness. All of this stuff is now under the mindfulness umbrella. It didn't just, mindfulness is something that's a term we use now, but it always, was here. And there's therapists that incorporate these things. There's therapists that incorporate religious practices. But when we talk about cultural beliefs, a lot of times people look at it in silos and think that I can't have both. And my argument is that let's make this a comprehensive treatment plan that includes all of your identities, your beliefs, and your values. And then the other fear is having a therapist who is not competent in developing interventions that will meet the needs of a person's religious or cultural belief system. And so that's another reason why people avoid going to therapy. So, things that you can do: be accessible, respond to emails in a timely manner. I know that sounds pretty easy, but you'd be surprised. Set up video and audio chats for office hours. Sometimes it's good to see a person's face, to see what's going on with them, and so that they can see your face and connect with you, because we don't really get to connect the way we used to. Now, granted, everyone is not able to because of their situation, but I've had students talk to me in the back of Popeyes because they were at work. So, if they're willing to do it, then be open and accessible. Create a virtual office. We have so many tools at our disposal at Mercer. Blackboard, Collaborate, Zoom, Google Meet, Slack, all of these things. And there's so much more. And a lot of them give educator discounts now, or they just make it free for educators. And this is just some. This is a very small sampling of places you can actually create a virtual office. I think that's be attentive and fully present. It's so easy for us to respond to text messages or emails when we're talking to someone on video, but it means so much to that person when they have eye contact and you're fully engaged and present with them. If you're referring the student, I always, and I know sometimes on email, uh, it may sound harsh, but a lot of times you may hear me say on email, offer multiple student support services when you offer counseling. And mainly it's because it's the stigma around counseling. And the other session last week for adjuncts, there was the recent study done during the pandemic. And although 72% of college students say they would love to have counseling, only 30% actually take advantage. And at Mercer is less than 10%. Probably less than 1% of our students actually take advantage of counseling services. So with that being said, when we offer it to students as a resource, offer it along with other resources that the college offers and make it sound like an amazing thing, which a lot of faculty are great about because I've seen the emails. So thank you for that. And also include the web links because we assume the students know how to navigate educational technology. I can tell you, educational technology was not made by generation X, Y, or Z. And so a lot of times it's not as easy to navigate as you would think for Gen Zers. So therefore, I would say include the links so that they don't have to go looking for them to these services. Don't make assumptions about what the student needs. Ask. Don't impose your ideals, values, or beliefs. We all have different value systems and belief systems. It's not up to you to, you may really feel passionate about what the student should do. But at the end of the day, it's a recommendation. We can't mandate anything. But we can encourage and we can be supportive. Don't force it. Sometimes a person starts telling you or opening up to you, don't start asking them detailed questions and sometimes the stories are salacious and it's really easy to try to to want to know more, but don't force it. It's their story and how they tell it is their choice. So they may not feel comfortable telling you everything. And you'll be surprised how many things that people will ask inappropriately in terms of even peers amongst each other. We sometimes do it, right? So be aware of that and don't force it. Let the person tell what they want to tell you. Be aware of your own limitations and ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask, do you feel like you want to hurt yourself or someone else? And if they say yes, then you direct them to emergency services. Not me, because we're in a remote setting and we need to make sure that they get immediate help. Yes, you will follow up with me, but in the moment, they need to be directed to the nearest emergency service.
Excuse me, Dr.
Yes.
Yah. Could you just expand on that a little bit for people who are unfamiliar with those processes in terms of the crisis screeners and
Yes.
things like, because I just don't want people to have the impression that they say, oh, if you're feeling that way, you should go to the ER. If somebody answers yes to that question, it's you sit with them and you call 911 for them, right?
Yes. So the thing is, because we're virtual, it's kind of tough. If we were on campus, it's so much easier, right? But what I've been telling people to do virtually, as we come up with protocols, as you know, this is new to us, right? Being in a completely virtual environment. on the counseling webpage, it actually has the contact information to psych emergency services for Mercer County. Now, your student may not be in Mercer County, but you can always, when in doubt, call 911, right? You also want to find out, is somebody with that person? And find out who they are, get their contact information so you can follow up. But hopefully there's somebody with them that can help guide the process. But it is difficult because we're remote. But all of that information is on our counseling webpage. Psych emergency, here's the other issue with psych emergency services. A lot of counties have very limited staffing, so they may direct you somewhere else. I'm not as familiar with Mercer County, but as far as how much traffic they get, but what I would say is, when in doubt, you would call 911. But the phone numbers and contacts are on our website. What I would say to do is probably take a picture of it so that you have it easily accessible. Let's see. So when you report these incidents, or if there's a behavior concern in your classroom, please report just the facts. One of the things that I've experienced, now I used to be a judicial officer once upon a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And one of the things that I learned from that was just reporting the facts. No interpretations. You don't need to tell us what you think their diagnosis is, or describe the symptoms or behavior in psychological terms. Not necessary. What is necessary is to know what is the behavior that is concerning, using descriptive language. So you wouldn't use language that is subjective. Okay. And that's important for multiple reasons. One being liability, and two being we're trying to get an accurate idea of what's going on so that we know what we're dealing with, so we know how to proceed. So the best way, if multiple people have to read this report and you want them all to come to the same conclusion, it may be different than a conclusion that you have. But if you report the facts and your observations without your interpretation, we can all look at that and discuss it and see how best to move forward. So with that being said, I will send out, it won't be this, but there'll be a PowerPoint from last week that includes a lot of this that will be sent out to you. But if there's any questions, I didn't think I would get through that in the time, but I did. I'm excited. So are there any questions that you have? And Crystal is on the line as well, who's the other, our student support clinician from Oaks Integrated Care. So Crystal, if you want to answer any questions, feel free, not to put you on the spot or anything.
It's okay. I saw some good questions in the chat. The last one was about calling 911, especially with people of color, students of color. And I think that's a good point. Just working at Oaks, I've had to contact 911, and it can become a trauma for somebody of color, right? Not just the fear of being harmed by police, but also not feeling like they could trust the police at that time, and then having anger toward you for calling, right? So I do think it's a good idea to definitely explore not just what the student is saying at the time, thinking I have to call 911 right away, but asking more questions and getting more information. Maybe they have family there that could take them to crisis. Maybe they have supports that could help call crisis or calling crisis with them. So I think it's good to definitely explore different aspects, not just what the student is saying to you in that moment, asking more questions and not being afraid to ask questions.
So, and to add to that, thank you, Crystal. So I was just going through the chat looking. Adverse childhood events, that's a whole nother session. And that's another hour session there too. But in terms of, yes, I always grapple with that, to be honest with you. Even being on campus, I grapple with it because every place that I've worked, the police always respond. And some colleges and universities have campus police. Campus police typically do a good job because they know they're dealing with students. But when you're dealing with local police, that relationship doesn't exist. And so then there's always that concern of, can this go left, right? So I have grappled with that. In the end, I still have to do what is best for the student and call, but I am there as an advocate. Unfortunately, it's still, there's chances we take, right? But I've had great situations where basically I've met with the police before they came in and talked to them. And that usually de-escalates the situation. So I talk to the police first before they see the person. I also let the student know what is going to transpire and that the police are the first responders that typically come first. And explain the unfortunate part, and I'm new to Mercer. I've only been here since September. But in Philadelphia, the unfortunate part was that they handcuff the person when they take them, which is traumatizing. So what we did was we ended up meeting with the police, psych emergency services. But unfortunately, in Philadelphia, there's only one psych emergency service unit for the entire city, and they can't service the whole city. So our system is overwhelmed and there's not enough support. And we need more advocates in our community fighting for mental health support for people in our community. Because when you look at those who deal with substance abuse issues, when you look at poverty, when you look at trauma, they're the ones who are going to have the hardest time with mental health. And even the act of getting help can be traumatizing if you have to deal with law enforcement. So that is something that we grapple with. But unfortunately, most cities, that's who responds first if psych emergency services doesn't have someone available. Or sometimes they come with psych emergency services, which was the incident last summer when a gentleman died. His mother called called 911, and the police came for a psych emergency, and her son ended up dead. So this is something that I work on beyond my 9 to 5. A lot of what I do is advocacy and activism around mental health, in terms of how do we provide more support when we talk about law enforcement, emergency services, so we can have wraparound services for people so that when they encounter, because again, depression, one of the symptoms is aggression. and agitation, right? And so if I'm met with a police officer and I don't trust him and I'm dealing with, I'm in psychological crisis, then that further adds to the crisis, which is what we witnessed last summer in that unfortunate incident in Philadelphia. So this is something that's, definitely bigger than us, but it is something that personally I work on in terms of advocacy and activism.